The last human standing. The Orion 4 Deep Space Research Station was dying. Its once gleaming corridors were now filled with thick clouds of smoke, sparking control panels, and the echoes of failing life support systems. Lights flickered, casting erratic shadows against the steel bulkheads, while distant warning sirens howled their mechanical death cries. At the edge of a massive observation deck, floating just beyond the artificial gravity's influence, Ethan Voss watched the last escape shuttles disappear into the void. His oxygen levels were critical. His ship was gone. His team had abandoned him. The Xilari, the highly advanced alien species who had built this station, had left him for dead. Primitive human. Their leader had sneered before departing. Your kind lacks the intellectual capacity to comprehend our superior technology. Accept your fate with dignity. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog up the cracked visor of his helmet. Then he smirked. Dignity. Yeah, not really my thing. He reached down and tightened his grip on the wrench strapped to his belt. They thought he was done for. They thought they had left him in a tomb of malfunctioning technology. They thought he was incapable of fixing their perfect station. They were about to learn the most important lesson of their lives. Never underestimate a human mechanic. The mess they left behind. The Orion 4 station wasn't just falling apart, it was actively trying to kill him. Ethan pushed himself away from the observation window, engaging the magnetic clamps on his boots to snap him back onto the steel floor. He moved quickly, dodging exposed wiring, navigating around collapsed ceiling panels, and sidestepping pools of coolant fluid leaking from broken pipes. The station was a nightmare. The Xilari had built everything to be the pinnacle of technological perfection, which meant it was so over-engineered that nothing worked properly. A simple air filtration unit required 6 separate AI approvals just to adjust the pressure levels. The power grid was wired through an interdimensional relay that simulated infinite energy possibilities, none of which actually provided usable power when the station was in distress. Even the coffee machine had been designed with quantum entanglement principles, making it capable of brewing caffeine across parallel timelines, but not in the present moment when he actually needed it. Ethan muttered to himself as he pulled up the station schematics on his wrist tablet. They made everything complicated just because they could. No redundancies, no fail-safes, just a billion useless systems stacked on top of each other. No wonder this thing is breaking apart. The Xilari had spent years perfecting a station that was supposed to be flawless. And yet, it had taken them only 3 weeks to completely lose control of it. He shook his head. Amateurs. Step 1. Keeping himself alive. Ethan's oxygen supply was running low. The station's main life support systems were fried, caught in a never-ending recursive loop of self-diagnosis and error messages. If he didn't get them working soon, he'd pass out long before he had the chance to fix anything else. He reached a nearby control panel, fingers flying across the alien interface. Nothing responded. The system had been locked behind quantum security protocols, requiring an authorization sequence of 14 multi-dimensional passcodes. Ethan stared at the screen, then at the wrench in his hand. Well, I don't have a passcode, but I do have this. With a grunt, he slammed the wrench into the panel, sparks flying as the delicate Xilari biometric scanner shattered. Immediately, the system defaulted to manual override mode. Ethan grinned. Primitive. Maybe, but effective. Damn right. He bypassed the failing AI subroutines, redirecting basic oxygen flow through mechanical relays instead of digital controls. Within seconds, the station hissed to life, vents expelling stale air as fresh oxygen flooded back into the system. His helmet sensors beeped, oxygen levels stabilizing. He exhaled in relief. Step 1. Survive. Step 2. Make this place work. Step 2. Fixing the unfixable. The station groaned, metal straining under its own failing gravity stabilizers. If Ethan didn't re-establish core powers soon, Orion 4 would start collapsing in on itself. But the main reactor had been shut down remotely by the auxiliary. They didn't want a human messing with their sacred technology. Too bad for them. Ethan wasn't asking for permission. He sprinted toward the reactor bay, dodging sparking cables and collapsing bulkheads as the station's failing gravity caused objects to float unpredictably. And when they did, they'd destroy the station completely, just to erase the embarrassment of needing a human to fix their masterpiece. Ethan cracked his knuckles. If they were coming back, then he had some work to do. He wasn't just going to fix their station. He was going to make it better than they ever could. And when the auxiliary returned, they would wish they had never left him behind. The human engineer's revenge. The Orion 4 research station was no longer a dying wreck. It wasn't fully operational yet, but it was stable, something the auxiliary engineers had failed to accomplish despite their supposedly superior intellect and quantum-enhanced calculations. Now, the only thing Ethan Voss had to do was make sure it stayed that way. And then, he was going to turn it into something the auxiliary could never have imagined. If they wanted to wipe away their embarrassment, they'd have to fight him for it. Fixing the broken foundations, Ethan moved through the station, scanning every failing system. With power restored, most of the station's automated diagnostics were coming back online. But even now, he could see just how badly designed the auxiliary's so-called flawless technology really was. Who the hell builds a reactor that needs 17 separate AI approvals just to change the output voltage? He muttered. Most of their core systems weren't actually broken. They were just stuck in endless loops of over-complex problem-solving algorithms. The auxiliary had spent years designing machines that could calculate infinite probabilities, predict every possible outcome, and find the most perfect solution to every problem. But in doing so, they had forgotten one very basic rule of engineering. Sometimes you don't need a perfect solution. You just need one that actually works. Ethan set to work, rerouting essential functions away from the quantum processors, forcing the systems to make decisions based on immediate needs rather than endless calculations. Life support shouldn't have to simulate the atmosphere of every species in the known galaxy. It just needed to make sure the one species still on board could breathe. The station's waste recycling system was so complex that it was simultaneously trying to manage waste for silicon-based life forms, methane breathers, and creatures that metabolized pure radiation. Ethan ripped out the useless subroutines and reprogrammed it to do what it was actually supposed to do. And the ship's navigation it was so paranoid about potential collision probabilities that it refused to let the station adjust its orbit, meaning it had been drifting closer and closer to a nearby asteroid belt, which, ironically, was the exact thing it was supposed to be avoiding. Ethan forced it to accept manual control, which was a lot easier than expected after he simply disconnected 3 unnecessary fail-safes and bypassed the system's overcomplicated quantum encryption. There. Fixed it. No quantum mechanics needed. He wiped his hands, satisfied. The auxiliary's next move. Ethan had no illusions about what was coming next. The auxiliary hadn't abandoned the station just because it was failing. They had left because they thought it was unsalvageable. And more importantly, because they refused to acknowledge that a human could ever fix their technology. But once they realized that he had, they wouldn't just sit back and accept it. They would return. And they would do everything in their power to make sure nobody ever found out about it. Ethan pulled up the station's long-range scanners. The auxiliary fleet hadn't returned yet, but that didn't mean they weren't watching. They were probably gathering intelligence, trying to understand how he was still alive, and more importantly, how their technology was still functioning. Ethan smirked. Good. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when you underestimate a human. The upgrades begin. Fixing the station was one thing, but fixing it wasn't enough. If Ethan was going to survive the auxiliary's inevitable counterattack, he needed to do more than just patch their broken systems. He needed to upgrade them. He scoured the station's storage bays, searching for anything useful. To his surprise, he found a treasure trove of abandoned equipment, spare parts, raw materials, and advanced alien tools that the Xelari had left behind in their arrogant rush to evacuate. Most of their systems were too complicated for their own good, but the materials themselves. Top of the line. Ethan grinned as he dug through the crates, already forming a plan. The Xelari might have designed this station, but now it belonged to him, making it human-proof. The first thing Ethan did was make everything simpler. He replaced the quantum-enhanced control panels with basic analog backups. He built a manual override system for every major function. He reconfigured the station's security system so that it actually worked, instead of wasting time analyzing improbable future threats. By the time he was finished, Orion 4 was no longer a Xelari death trap. It was a human-engineered masterpiece. But he wasn't done yet. Setting the ultimate trap. Ethan knew the Xelari would be back. And when they arrived, they would expect to find a station barely holding together, running on human desperation and dumb luck. Instead, he was going to show them exactly what human engineering could do. He tore into the station's internal coding, setting up layered security overrides that would lock out Xelari control protocols the moment they tried to regain access. He rerouted energy reserves into hidden weapon platforms that the Xelari had never activated because they were still in the calibration phase. Seriously, who leaves their own defense systems in an unfinished test mode? He even reprogrammed the station's emergency beacons to broadcast false distress signals, making it seem like everything was still failing, even when it wasn't. And then, for the final touch, he rigged the entire station's AI system to shut down the moment it detected a Xelari life form on board. No warnings, no second chances, just complete, catastrophic system failure. And the best part, he left it all disguised under their own coding structure. By the time they realized what had happened, it would be too late. Come and get me. Ethan leaned back, surveying his work. The station was no longer just a research outpost. It was a fortress. The Xelari had left him to die in what they thought was a doomed station. Now, they were walking into a trap of their own making. He smirked, glancing out the window at the empty void beyond. All right, Xelari. You wanted to see what a primitive human could do. He grabbed his wrench and tightened a bolt on the console, locking everything into place. Come and find out. The return of the Xelari fleet. The Orion 4 research station had been a masterpiece of Xelari engineering, a shining beacon of their technological superiority and intellectual dominance. At least, that's what they told themselves. Now, it was something else entirely. It was a human-engineered fortress, built by a man they had left for dead. And as the Xelari fleet dropped out of hyperspace, their sleek, polished warships forming a perfect tactical formation around the station, they had no idea what kind of hell they were about to walk into. Ethan Voss stood at the command console, watching them approach through the station's long-range scanners. A row of Xelari battlecruisers, glowing with the eerie blue light of their quantum reactors, were slowly moving into attack position. Ethan smirked, cracking his knuckles. All right, boys. You left me behind. Now let's see how you deal with the consequences. The arrogance of the Xelari. On the bridge of the Xelari flagship, Supreme Overseer Valtrix, HFY folded his arms, his silver exoskeletal armor gleaming under the ship's artificial lighting. He stared at the station's exterior, expecting to see chaos and ruin. Instead, he saw something impossible. The station's lights were stable. The rotational thrusters had been realigned. The energy readings were normal. It was functioning. No, more than that. It was thriving. A cold wave of disbelief washed over him. This cannot be. A Xelari technician, monitoring the data streams, hesitated. Sir, the station's power grid is at full operational capacity. Life support is optimal. Internal scans show no catastrophic failures. Valtrix's mandibles twitched in irritation. Explain. The technician shifted uncomfortably. Unknown. But It appears someone has repaired the station. For a moment, silence fell over the bridge. Then, the realization hit them all at once. The human. The primitive, backward, unworthy human they had abandoned weeks ago. He was still alive. And somehow, against all logic and reason, he had repaired their station when even they could not. Valtrix's clawed fingers gripped the edge of his command console. Unacceptable. He turned to his weapons officer. Deploy an assault team immediately. Board the station. I want that human in chains. The officer hesitated. Sir, if he has restored the station, we must assume he has access to its defenses. We should proceed with caution. I will not be humiliated by a human. Valtrix snarled. Send in the troops. Now. And with that, the invasion began. The humans' defense plan. Ethan watched the auxiliary fleet deploy boarding craft, their sleek drop pods breaking formation and heading straight for the station's docking bays. Right on schedule. He had spent weeks preparing for this. The auxiliary had designed Orion 4 with military security protocols, but they had never actually finished calibrating them. Their obsession with perfection had meant they never fully activated the defense grid, because it was still in the testing phase. Ethan had fixed that. The moment the boarding craft breached the station's perimeter, the automatic defenses came online. Electromagnetic pulse turrets fired, disabling the auxiliary's advanced eye-guided drones before they could even deploy. Blast doors sealed shut, trapping auxiliary soldiers in isolated corridors where their energy weapons were useless. Atmospheric pressure shifts forced them into low-gravity zones, making their rigid, armor-plated exosuits more of a liability than an advantage. One by one, the auxiliary forces began falling apart before they had even encountered Ethan himself. The battle inside the station. The auxiliary assault teams pushed forward, their plasma rifles glowing, moving through the dimly lit corridors of Orion 4. But they weren't prepared for what they found. Instead of the orderly, logical pathways they had originally designed, the station had been rewired. The corridors were filled with unpredictable obstructions. Entire sections had been rerouted into dead ends, and emergency doors locked behind them, forcing them into claustrophobic, enclosed spaces. Then the lights flickered off, and a voice, Ethan's voice, echoed through the station's comm systems. Hey there, boys. Miss me? The auxiliary soldiers whipped around, searching for the source. But Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the station itself was fighting them. Automated repair drones, which Ethan had reprogrammed, began attacking their armor, dismantling their weapons piece by piece. The gravity fields shifted, sending them spiraling into the ceiling before slamming them back down to the floor. The oxygen supply in certain sections was rerouted, making them gasp for air while their environmental suits failed to compensate. They had come expecting to subdue a human. Instead, they had walked into his trap. And Ethan. He was waiting for them in the engineering bay. The showdown. When the first squad of Celari commandos breached the engineering hub, they expected to find a desperate, cornered human. Instead, they found Ethan Voss leaning casually against the control panel, holding a wrench in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Took you long enough. The squad's leader, a massive Celari enforcer clad in obsidian battle armor, aimed his rifle. Surrender, human. You have no chance against us. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached over and flipped a switch. Oh yeah. The auxiliary soldier barely had time to react before the floor beneath them vanished. In an instant, the entire squad was sucked into an emergency airlock, a failsafe Ethan had rewired to eject anything that didn't have a human heat signature. The last thing they saw was Ethan's smug grin before the airlock blasted them back into space. The auxiliary's ultimate mistake. Back on the auxiliary flagship, Overseer Valtrix watched in horror as his troops failed. His elite forces, his unmatched warriors, they were being systematically outmaneuvered by a single human. A mechanic. A man with a wrench had just hijacked their most advanced research station and was turning their own technology against them. For the first time in his long, decorated career, Valtrix felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Then, Ethan's voice came through the open comms channel. "Hey, Valtrix, is it? Quick question. How does it feel to be out-engineered by a guy who fixes coffee machines?" The Xilari's mandibles twitched violently. Ethan continued, "You came here thinking you were gonna take me down. But now, you're trapped in my station, your soldiers are getting their asses kicked, and pretty soon, you're gonna have to admit that a primitive human just outplayed the smartest species in the galaxy." Valtrix trembled with rage. "You will regret this, human." Ethan grinned. "Nah, you will." And then he flipped the station's master override switch. The fall of the Xilari. The Orion 4 research station, once a shining beacon of Xilari technological supremacy, was now a death trap of their own making. And at its heart stood one human, a mechanic with a wrench and a grudge. Ethan Voss had hijacked the Xilari's masterpiece, rewired their flawless systems, and turned their over-engineered nightmare into a human-engineered fortress. And now, he was about to shut them down for good. The master override. The moment Ethan flipped the master override switch, the entire station lurched violently. Onboard systems that had been paralyzed by endless Xilari bureaucratic redundancies suddenly came alive. Energy surged through forgotten circuits. Weapons platforms hummed with power. Security protocols rebooted with one simple priority: protect Ethan Voss. On the Xilari flagship, Overseer Valtrix HFY watched in horror as the station flipped from an easy target to a fortress of doom. What has he done? A Xilari officer, scrambling at the control panels, was barely able to stammer out a response. "Sir, he's activated everything." The trap springs shut. Inside the station, the remaining Xilari commandos found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Every corridor was now an active hazard. Automated security turrets, previously in calibration mode, were now online and tracking Xilari lifeforms as hostiles. Gravity fields shifted without warning, sending fully armored Xilari soldiers tumbling like ragdolls. Reprogram drones swarmed through the air, disassembling enemy weapons on contact. And in the engineering hub, Ethan leaned back in his chair, feet kicked up on the console, watching the chaos unfold through the station's security feeds. He took a sip of his almost coffee, a concoction brewed from whatever alien beans he could find. "Not bad," he muttered, watching Xilari warriors get slammed into walls by their own malfunctioning gravity systems. "Needs sugar, though." Desperation on the Xilari bridge. On board the Xilari flagship, Valtrix's mandibles twitched violently. This was impossible. They had spent decades designing this station, refining it to perfection. And now, in a matter of weeks, one human had not only repaired it, but made it deadlier than ever. Valtrix turned to his weapons officer. "Enough. Fire on the station. Destroy it completely." The weapons officer hesitated. "Sir, if we fire on the station now, we'll destroy our own forces inside." Valtrix's eyes burned with rage. "Do it." The Xilari warship unleashed a barrage of plasma fire, its turrets glowing with the heat of destruction. But the moment the first blast hit the station, something unexpected happened. The station's shields, which had been left incomplete by the Xilari, suddenly flared to life. Ethan had rewired the power grid, drawing energy from non-essential systems, and had routed the entire defensive shield system through a single, brutally efficient power relay. Unlike the Xilari, who had been too obsessed with balance and redundancy, Ethan had prioritized strength. And it worked. The incoming blasts slammed into the shield barrier and dissipated harmlessly. Inside the engineering hub, Ethan grinned, sipping his coffee. "Oh, you didn't know. I finished your shield project for you." He leaned forward, flicking the switch. "My turn." Turning the station into a weapon. The Xilari had never fully activated Orion 4's weapon systems because they were still running simulations on their efficiency. Ethan, however, didn't care about efficiency. He cared about results. The station's plasma turrets, which had been left in standby mode for decades, roared to life. Suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. The first blast tore through a Xilari destroyer, splitting it in half like a knife through paper. The second shot ignited a warship's ammunition reserves, turning it into a fireball of debris. The third fired directly at Valtrix's flagship, sending waves of fire across its hull. On the Xilari bridge, Valtrix staggered as the ship rocked violently. "How is TAISPOSIBL?" Ethan's voice came over the open comms. "It's called pressing the big red button. Try it sometime." The Xilari's last stand. Realizing that their fleet was being annihilated, Valtrix ordered a full retreat. But Ethan wasn't about to let them go that easily. He activated one last trick. The station's tractor beams, which had been gathering dust in an unused corner of the system, suddenly activated. A massive gravitational field latched onto the fleeing warships, pulling them back toward the station. Valtrix felt his blood turn cold. They weren't escaping. They were being dragged into range. Ethan smiled. "Where do you think you're going? You haven't even seen my best work yet." The final blow. The Xilari fleet was in ruins. Their warships were crippled, their commandos captured or dead, and their most advanced research station was now under human control. Valtrix stared at the view screen, unable to process what had happened. A single human had outmaneuvered their entire species. Their greatest achievement was no longer theirs. And then, to make matters worse, Ethan sent out a broadcast. To everyone. The galaxy learns the truth. Across the galaxy, on thousands of worlds, Ethan's face appeared on news networks, holoscreens, and military channels. He stood in the command center of Orion 4, wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit, holding a wrench and sipping coffee. And then he spoke. "Hey there, Galaxy. Name's Ethan Voss. You might have heard of the Xilari, the geniuses who thought they were the smartest species in the universe." He gestured to the wreckage of their fleet outside his window. Turns out, their superior technology was so complicated even they couldn't fix it. So I did. And now this station, it's mine. He took another sip. To anyone watching this, if you've ever been told humans are inferior, if you've ever been abandoned, if you've ever been underestimated, know this: we're not just survivors. He leaned closer. We build, we adapt, and we win. The broadcast ended, and across the galaxy, for the first time, the Xilari realized they were no longer the dominant force in the stars. Aftermath. A new beginning. The Xilari had fallen. Orion 4 was no longer a research station. It was now the first human-controlled space fortress in the Xilari Empire. And at its helm, Ethan Voss stood with a wrench, a cup of coffee, and an empire's worth of enemies, now realizing they had made a very, very big mistake.